Spain, Catalonia, Andalusia, Portugal, the Basque Country, Galicia, Asturias. These are the lands that come to mind when we think of the word Iberia, not Celts. That we reserve for the western fringes of the British Isles. And yet the Celtic peoples had a civilization that spanned the breadth of Europe. And in Iberia, a specific branch of Celtic emerged, Celtiberian. There were other groups of Celts within Iberia, but in this video I'm going to focus on Celtiberian. I'm Benjamin, and I'm making this video because I released a poll asking you which of several ancient civilizations you wanted me to make a video on, and this is the one you requested. So this is a fascinating history, and a very tenacious people. Let's get into the video. If you would like to donate to the channel, do so below. By the year 1000 BCE, a Proto-Celtiberian culture had emerged along the river Douro and going south to the river Tajo, or Tagus. Groups of warrior elites had broken off the Hallstatt culture of Central Europe. There is no agreement on which route they took to Iberia, sea or land. What is certain is that over the next few centuries there was more than one Celtic migration into Iberia. My opinion is that the first waves came along sea routes, as this would explain the settlements in both northwest Iberia and Ireland being Q-Celtic rather than P-Celtic, like Welsh. In this scenario, a Celtic base was established along the lower river Douro in Portugal, the third longest river in Iberia. This first Celtic group would have been built by roaming warrior bands of young men, as is common across Indo-European cultures in the age. The genetic imprint does suggest that the female lines remained Iberian. By the year 900 BCE, a distinct fusion civilization of Celtic and Iberian came into being. The Celtic language here would be recognizable by their cousins to the northwest, but it began to be influenced and changed by the Iberian culture. Whilst sharing Celtic deities like Cernunnos, a horned figure, and Epona or Ebona, a female queen deity related to horses, linked distantly to the Welsh name Rhiannon. This culture also took on warrior deification customs, in which the leaders of the war bands were attached with spiritual presence and often divinity. This belief system reflected the warrior aristocracy of the culture, and even changed the burial customs over time, with burial in places reserved exclusively for warriors after a practice of excarnation, meaning to remove the flesh of the corpse. And they did so by laying the bodies on public stones to allow birds to carry away the flesh and the meat of the dead. Silius Italicus described two kinds of burial common to Iberia later, and he wrote this about excarnation. To these men death in battle is glorious, and they consider it a crime to burn the body of such a warrior, for they believe the soul goes up to the gods in heaven, if the body is devoured on the field by the hungry vulture. They also in places believed that women had the gift of prophecy, and merited respect to a greater degree than their Roman and Carthaginian neighbors. Another wave of Celtic migration came out of Gaul in the 6th century BCE. The fact this did not shift the Celtic language spoken here from Q-Celtic to P-Celtic shows us that across northwest Iberia, these Celtic groups had already established themselves for centuries before the split in the Celtic language is seen today. The Celts of Iberia rarely fought in large armies until the Roman era. They preferred cattle raids, guerrilla ambushes, and one-on-one champion fights. With this new wave of Celtic into Iberia, we see further use of champions to solve disputes between tribes. This is when two war bands or small armies confronted each other, usually at river crossings, fords, and each put forth their champion, in a fight to the death to decide the war for all of them. This was common across the Celtic world, and was a useful way to avoid large battles and needless death. We find this in the Irish story Táin Bó, as well as in the life of Owain Gwynedd, a Welsh prince who is recorded as having fought such battles. The Gauls also fought this way. However, around this time in the early 6th century BCE, the Tartessians in the south, who probably had a fusion culture of pre-Indo-European language and Celtic imports, went through a civilizational collapse, which threw the whole Iberian Peninsula into a period of social instability. Greek colonies shift from the south coast to the east coast, bringing Celts of the interior into contact with Greece through the Ebro River Valley. During this chaotic period around 600 BCE, the Castro culture, which had grown out of the lower Douro River, spread across the Celtic-speaking areas of Iberia. This was not a polity or the rule over others by a group, but rather a style, the building of castros, meaning hill forts in Spanish, across the region. In this phase, the Celtic Iberians became more militaristic and distinct tribal groups began to emerge. The specific people we call the Celtiberians had not yet fully emerged when war bands of the Celtic Vacae tribal people, whose ancestors had come from Gaul, raided up the Douro River into the central plateau of Iberia, the Meseta Central. These Celts pushed over the watershed into the upper Tajo River, or Tagus River, the longest river in Iberia, and swept down into the southwest with other Celtic groups. Out of these frontier raiding parties in the Meseta Central emerged the Celtiberians as a ruling elite over the natives. They then formed into several tribes over the following 2 centuries. The Aravaci, who became the biggest later, the Vacae, who expanded in the west, the Carpetani, the Titi, the Lusones, and the Ocades, and a few others. Each of these would have grown out of kinfolk, or clan family groups, ruled by related bands of warrior elites. Their territory was firmly marked to the northwest by the Ebro River as a border between them and those who would become the Basques, a non-Indo-European people. To the east over the coastal ranges lay the Iberians, who spoke a language we have yet to classify. To the west and south, however, it is more difficult for us to know where Celtic began and where Lusitanian, another Indo-European group, ended. These two groups were clearly overlapping, with the Celtici and Lusitanians migrating over the same areas. However, for our subject, the Celtiberians expanded over the upper Douro and Tajo valleys, with a concentration of cattle wealth and military power growing across the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. The Celtiberians developed double-edged swords, later adopted by Rome. They also developed elaborate equestrian technology in horse harnesses and decoration, though they did not yet use horses in large battle formations. Out of this time, the castros, or hill forts, slowly gave way to oppida, cities which ruled over a collection of hill forts. It has to be noted that across the Celtic world, from the Gaulish centres of Bilbracte and Delicia in present-day France, to Britain's power capitals of Verlamion, today's St. Albans, and Calava of the Atrebates at Silchester, Dunsberg of the German Latin era. This was a development within Celtic society across Western Europe. The embryos of future Celtic city-states were forming, as had happened in Greece and Italy earlier. The status symbols of weaponry, swords, buried with warriors, shifted to sumptuous objects imported goods, jewelry. By the 4th century BCE, the Celtiberians are hiring themselves out as mercenaries in foreign armies and bringing back new cultural ideas with them from around the Western Mediterranean. Around this time, the weapons found in earlier graves are fewer. Some believe the material culture was taking precedent, whilst others think the rise of Rome and Carthage in the east meant weapons were needed more above ground. I think it was a combination of both reasons: material wealth and the rise of foreign powers. As the Western Mediterranean heated up with wars between Rome and Carthage, the Celtiberians were dragged into recorded history by people writing about them from far away. Before I get into Carthage and Rome coming into Iberia, I need to mention that Iberia was a cultural sphere unto itself, a world, much like the British Isles and Gaul together kind of were, Scandinavia, Germania, Dacia, present-day Romania, and other parts around there. And because of that, they had developed internal ideas about themselves in relation to different groups within that cultural world. The Tartessians had developed a written language, a written script, based with some Phoenician influence, but on pre-Indo-European ideas, pre-Celtic, with Celtic influences. The Iberians, they developed their own written script as well, with a lot of influence from Phoenician, and even an Iberian script based on Greek. Now, the Celtiberians, they took the Iberian script and adapted it for their own Celtic language. These three, the Tartessian, the Celtiberian script, and the Iberian script, fused the ideas of an alphabet and a syllabary, whilst the Greek Iberian script was just an alphabet. A syllabary combines vowel and consonant in a monopheme to express a sound, like ku, ko, not just k or o, but fusing those together in one written symbol. Cherokee does this in North America. A lot of languages do, it's just not many do in Europe. After the Carthaginian Empire had lost the First Punic War against Rome, losing most of Sicily, the Carthaginians realized they had to have a bigger territory and wealth base to take on Rome. But in which direction could Carthage expand? The Iberian Celts to the west possessed a region very rich in metals. Given that Carthage had colonized parts of southern Iberia already, made this the obvious direction of Carthaginian expansion. Which was not good for the Celts, was it? Carthage launched a campaign into Celtic Iberia, organized by Hamilcar Barca, the father of a young Hannibal, who would fight Rome later using Celtiberian mercenaries. In this case, Hamilcar put Hannibal in charge of the force that drove north into Celtic lands, meeting an alliance of 3 tribes at the Battle of Tagus. This was the largest battle in pre-Roman Iberia, involving around 40,000 Celts, from the Carpetani, Vacae, and Ocades peoples. It was a decisive victory for young Hannibal and Carthage over a massive force. In 226 BCE, Carthage and Rome signed the Ebro Treaty, essentially dividing Iberia between them. Carthage was given all the land southeast of the Ebro River. Whilst on paper Carthage ruled the Celtiberians, they were largely free of Carthaginian rule and did as they wished. The Aravaca tribe of Celtiberians had not joined the alliance in fighting Carthage, which means they had not suffered a defeat in war. They remained strong and took advantage of neighboring tribes being weaker for the moment, and Carthage being distracted by a renewed war with Rome. They established a Celtiberian confederacy alongside their neighbors the Lusones, Belli and Titi, with Numantia as their capital. I must note, this is very similar to what the Aedui did in Celtic Gaul 2 centuries later, as well as what the Caduvallani did in Britain in the decades before the Roman invasion. In each of the 3 cases, the Celtiberians, the Gauls, and the Britons Some of their leaders were trying to unify their lands into a state before Rome could get to them. In each case, they only needed a few more decades to unify their people. Meanwhile, Hannibal had vowed as a boy to be a lifelong enemy of Rome, and when Rome, 6 years after the Ebro Treaty, went back on its word and planted a colony on the Iberian coast, south of the Ebro River, Carthage attacked Rome. In the Second Punic War that followed, Celtic Iberians served as mercenaries in Hannibal's army as he marched with elephants over the Alps and into Italy. But the Celtiberian Confederacy remained neutral. Shortly after, in 195, in an unprovoked attack, the Roman consul Cato the Elder made a foray into the Celtiberian heartland, attacking the city of Numantia. The Celtiberians repelled him and forced him back to the coast. It was the first Roman attack on Celtiberians. However, Rome turned tribes against each other and won the Second Punic War, taking over Carthaginian Iberia. By the end of the 3rd century BCE, Celtiberians were writing their laws in bronze. They had private ownership of land, developed age classes, and created elaborate male initiation rituals for their fighters with patriarchs ruling over city-states who were given divine lineage in the ancient past. They created clientele armies, as was seen with the Aztecs at the height of their civilization. This meant that the capital Numantia held sway not merely over the castros, the hill forts, but that it was beginning to control other Opita city-states and expecting that other tribes serve in their army. This was the development of a polity. Even early forms of taxation appeared to be present, with Celtiberian coinage. But this was not to say the Celtiberian economy was developed as Carthage or Rome. It was not. This was an agricultural economy, which also depended on border raids, cattle raids, and small-scale guerrilla bands to take goods from others beyond their borders. Naturally, this caused disagreement with their neighbors, and so the Celtiberians across the Mesetal Central, as well as down the Douro and Tajo rivers, leading down into Lusitanian lands, developed a native system of peacekeeping called hospitium, or hospitality. These hospitium were portable documents, which two people signed and then split in half between them, so they could pass through the other's territory in a condition of peace. These were written in the native Celtiberian language, except if Romans were involved. Often these took the shape of animals or hands, and were made of metal. It is very likely these were made of wood or even paper as well. From the end of the Second Punic War in 201 BCE, the Celtiberians had an annoying next-door neighbor, called the Roman Republic. No one wants Rome as a next-door neighbor, do they? Tensions flared up off and on between Rome and the Celtiberians in the 190s, with Rome slaughtering some of the tribes along its borders for no apparent reason. What follows, not just in Celtiberian lands but all of Iberia, is 200 years of warfare between the natives and the Romans. It is easy to see how Rome, planting colonies on the coast, slaughtering random villages, and then expecting that Celtic peoples further inland provide Rome with grain as a kind of tax, could lead to war. The First Celtiberian War broke out in 181 BCE, which was lost badly by the Celtiberians. Tiberius Gracchus claimed to have destroyed 300 Celtiberian towns, but the number was likely much lower and made of castros and very small villages. However, it's still a lot, and since Rome was relatively new to lands beyond the coast, they only imposed a 5% grain tax and forbid new Celtiberian cities. A semi-peace held for 25 years, with only a few incidents of violence. Further southwest, the Lusitanians rose up against Rome in 155 BCE, along with their neighbors the Vitones, a fellow pre-Celtic Indo-European people. Following victories against Rome by the Lusitanians, the Celtiberians rose up in a revolt of their own. The Aravaci won a major battle against the Roman consul Nobilor. Both the Celtiberians and the Lusitanians defeated Rome in battles during these two wars happening simultaneously in the 150s. A Roman siege of Numantia failed, and the Romans were pushed back. But the Celtiberian tribes, who did not use cavalry in the same way in which Romans did, nor armor, the difference is they had not developed their economy. Facing this situation, the Celtiberians made peace. In 146 BCE, with the Romans distracted in its third war with Carthage, the Lusitanians under the leader Viriathus revolted against Rome. Viriathus won 2 large, stunning victories over Rome, so the Celtiberians decided to take their chances. The Aravaci and the Celtiberian Confederacy aligned with Viriathus in revolt. A 10-year-long war followed in Celtiberian lands. Initially, Celtiberians and their allies had the upper hand. The Aravaci had spent most of the last 10 years modernizing the Celtiberian Confederacy's army, erecting defenses, and using horsemen. Meanwhile, the Romans finished off Carthage, and now faced a war on 2 fronts in Iberia. So they resorted to treachery, feigning peace or negotiations, only to massacre whole cities and assassinate leaders. Viriathus in the south was assassinated by treachery. The Celtiberians defeated 2 Roman generals. They repelled another siege on Numantia. Allies to the Aravaci, the Lusones tribe, were heavily depopulated by a new general, Quintus Macedonius. The Aravacis forced Macedonius to retreat after a failed attack by the Romans on their heartland. The Lusones were not wiped out, however, as they continued to rebel for decades afterward. A Celtiberian chieftain named Tagino crossed into Roman territory and massacred Iberian tribes allied to Rome, the Edetani and the Cidatani. He carved an arc of fire and scorched earth through present-day Valencia and Aragon. He then crossed the Ebro River with an army, leading the forces of Quintus Pompeius north, away from Celtiberian lands, giving other Celtiberians time to prepare a defense. Quintus Pompeius caught up with Tagino, using Numidian horsemen from Africa, and wiped out his army. This was a horrifying war. The Senate considered making peace, but in the end, sent in Consul Scipio with a large army to end the war. He put the Celtiberian capital to an 8-month-long siege, building 7 defensive towers around it. When they lost cities, the Celtiberians preferred suicide to surrender. Their capital, Numantia, turned to cannibalism. Several alliances of tribes tried to break the siege, but Rome won in the end. The people of Numantia committed suicide en masse. In the aftermath, Rome disbanded the Celtiberian Confederacy and allowed rival tribes to settle in Aravaci lands. Rome took firm control of central Iberia after this war, and the process of Latinization of Celtiberian culture carried forward across the Meseta Central, with the building of Roman temples and institutions on formerly Celtic sites in the decades after. There had been enough bloodshed. Central Iberia entered a period of relative peace, and Celtiberian society entered into a client phase under Roman administration. In the period afterwards, in the early 1st century BCE, more Celtiberian writing appears, such as the Botorita plaques, but they also began to write their own language in a Latin script, as shown here. They were becoming Romanized. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, they were Togati, people who wear togas, in the manner of the Romans. However, they had not lost themselves to a Roman identity. When an Iberian Roman general, Sertorius, revolted in the year 80 BCE, the Celtiberians slowly took his side. Sertorius revolted against a corrupt senate and a tyrant and a man named Lucius Sulla, who proclaimed himself dictator In the following civil war, Lucius Sulla died, but unfortunately for the Celtiberians, their Sertorian faction lost in Italy. The senators won. Sertorius rallied the tribes in Iberia underneath him, fighting a dirty guerrilla war through most of the next decade, ending in 72 BCE. This was the last organized resistance by the Celtiberian cities against Rome, and from this point they were slowly absorbed into the Roman culture. May I take this time to thank my Patreons, on the screen now. If you would like to donate to the channel, leave a super like, buy me a coffee, and we will see you in the next episode. Thank you very much.